Hey, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host Dom, and in today's video, I'm going to be doing a part two to my first video on Ratzinger's take on the relationship between nature and grace. While keeping in mind, the theological debate in the background. Ratzinger treads a path that actually steps outside of the framework of the debate as it's going on, because most of the debate is happening when it comes to St. Thomas Aquinas' teaching. And Ratzinger, he studied St. Bonaventure, and so his take on the relationship between nature and grace is Bonaventurian. But I said in the last video that if a vision of the world, the fruit of one's contemplative prayer, is a vision that is truly the fruit of one's contemplative prayer, and it's one that has proved effective in the life of the church, then it's going to be a theological school, you might say, that cannot be neatly sealed into a jar with certain delineations that cannot interact with other schools. In other words, it's not going to be in conflict with other, um, not necessarily in conflict with other schools of theology, but rather it's going to be much more porous and able to interact in a fruitful and constructive way. So I think that the answer moving forward is not to jettison St. Thomas if we find that Bonaventure's answer is better, but rather to find how we can learn from both, from the fruit of their prayer, and see how the truth of the Catholic faith is reflected from different facets in the theology of St. Thomas and the theology of St. Bonaventure. In other words, kind of complementary coexistence. There will be differences, but I think that's just the right way to approach theology, because the faith cannot be encapsulated by our thought, right? Instead, it prompts our thoughts to continue searching for, the depths of the word that has been spoken to us, through our Lord Jesus Christ. So we're going to continue reading from Joseph Ratzinger's book, Dogma and Preaching, Applying Christian Doctrine to Daily Life. This is from Ignatius Press. It's the first unabridged edition. You can see it here. And we're going to continue talking about this topic. Now, in my last video, someone left a comment that was very helpful. And the comment was, Dom, I think what you should do is define nature. And I realized that although I talked a lot about nature, I had not defined it. I was taking certain kind of general assumptions for granted, right? Now, what's interesting is that precisely in the second part, Ratzinger tries to define it. So we'll do that. So I'll just jump right into it and start with what Ratzinger says. Maybe to recap a little bit what I said last time, I started off with Ratzinger's observation on how Karl Marx and Jean-Paul Sartre, right, these two contemporary-ish, right, philosophers, if you can call Marx a philosopher, I guess he would be like a political philosopher. They actually deny the reality of nature. Marx reduces it to political and economic factors that need to be manipulated in order to usher in heaven on earth through man's doing, revolution, right? Sartre, right, will deny man's essence in the sense where he says that our existence precedes it and we determine our own essence. And the problem with man is that he's limited, right, all around him by other people, by society. And so man's freedom, right, is authenticity, breaking free from those limitations. And that obviously leads into a denial of human nature, which for Sartre is a limitation. So we can see how that actually feeds right into the culmination of this kind of thinking is a kind of radical gender theory that his friend Simone de Beauvoir really kind of built off of him in that area. And then you have that whole strand through Simone de Beauvoir to Judith Butler, into contemporary gender theory. It's very, postmodern and existentialist. So that's where he starts, right? He wants to criticize Marx and Sartre, and then he goes on to say that at the same time, in the background, in the culture, we have this idea that religion is a private affair that is really a therapy. He kind of gets this from Marx as well, right? Religion is the opium of the masses. It's a kind of therapy to deal with the anxiety of oppression in our lives, right? But it's a private affair. What's really real is the tangible world. And this we can see how it builds off of Kant, right? Who wants to deny the reality of the metaphysical. Now, of course, it's an oversimplification, but and affirm the reality of the individual's experience, right? So reality revolves around the individual instead of the individual and his knowledge, right, revolving around reality, like we have it in the scholastics, the church fathers, the Greeks, etc. So that's his criticism of that. Then he moves on to talk. Well, I moved on to talk about Trent, justification, and the roots of all this in the Protestant Reformation, and how Trent actually holds to, I would argue, the correct, not just metaphysical, but theological perspective that's truly biblical. And so, again, another point there for Trent, over and against Luther and Calvin. And Luther and Calvin, right, by holding on to this kind of total depravity of nature, creates a response of the supernatural that's radically extrinsicist, right, in the realm of salvation. And so that leads to, again, in a kind of intellectual genealogy up to the kind of existentialism we find in Sartre. But that was about justification. Then we walked through Ratzinger's explication of Saint Bonaventure's understanding. And here we saw that for Saint Bonaventure, although he will use a dyad, if that's, I think that's a word, right? A duality, I guess, of nature and grace in his writings, when he presses the issue and narrows in on this topic, he uses a triad. And the triad is nature, number one, will, number two, and then grace, the supernatural, number three. And he focuses on the will because the will has to do with freedom, and freedom is intimately tied in the tradition, as you guys know, to the spirit. And so, we basically went through, watched the first video, but I just, recapping is always good. I teach classes online, and I like to tell my students, repetitio est mater studiorum, right? Repetition is the mother of learning, or of studies. So Ratzinger talks about the natural course, the voluntary course, and the miraculous course. Well, technically, it's Bonaventure who talks about that. And corresponding to that, right, we have by nature, by free will, and by God. Corresponding to that, we have the innate habits, the acquired habits, and the infused habits. And this gives rise to a schema, a framework of various courses, cursus in Latin, right? The natural one, the voluntary one, and the miraculous or supernatural one, right? And so we have natural things for Bonaventure, human secrets, or human intimate, right, knowledge is kind of the way he puts it, and then divine mysteries, right? And so we have the natural knowledge, discernment, which is self-reflective, right, and freedom, will, and then heavenly illumination. That's Bonaventure's schema. And so Ratzinger, continues to comment on how this third category in the middle is a category of synthesis that requires supernatural help while not being something natural in the sense of the first category, but still being something that is predicated of man as a natural creature. So you have a paradox here where man is a supernatural nature, in a way where nature does not demand grace, because that would go against the gratuity of grace, while also in a way where man is made for the gift. So it's quite a beautiful schema, I know, you have to admit. So again, if that's not the schema of St. Thomas, one thing I think we can say is that whatever St. Thomas teaches, and whatever it's going to be, although different from St. Bonaventure, we can say that what St. Bonaventure says is true and beautiful and part of Catholic tradition, right? Without denigrating St. Thomas's teaching, which can also be true, beautiful, and part of Catholic tradition. And because these two schools of thought, these two traditions, right, are not these sealed off, right, perspectives clashing against each other, but are truly great visions of the world, that means they will be porous and will need to interact with each other and see what can come of that. And I think that's why Ratzinger's voice here is beneficial, helpful, and a breath of fresh air for because I've been reading the Neo Thomas and de Lubac on this, and both of them make good points. Honestly, I've already voiced my preference for de Lubac, but it's not really one that's dictated by it's more dictated by his conclusions than it is by the data of the commentary tradition and really even of St. Thomas himself, which is the big question. So therefore I'm trying not to be biased, right? I'm trying to just approach this as best I can. Now, let's go ahead and get into um, Ratzinger when it comes to what nature is. But before we do that, I want to read this section here that continues to build off of St. Bonaventure. And so here it goes. Ratzinger writes, this is on page 153 of that same book. He says, although the nature of man cannot be defined while disregarding the freedom of the spirit, right? Remember, I talked about man is natural, but the spirit is not the same category, and yet man is a natural creature that is spiritual. And so we already have a paradox here, but he says, although the nature of man cannot be defined while disregarding the freedom of the spirit, this implies also that it must not be defined while disregarding its history. What? Ratzinger is saying that history is an important category, and he will lament that it, you know, it kind of gets laid on the wayside later on, and nature is seen purely metaphysically and not in light of history. So there's a divorce between um, history and ontology, history and metaphysics. This is one of Ratzinger's big contributions. It's also not, it's not just him, but it's also a criticism of um, what had become the neo-Thomistic tradition. Now, this is complicated, right? I'm doing my best here, so I keep giving these caveats because I don't want to alienate anyone, and I am, open to learning from everyone and to having these conversations. But the criticism goes that um, the the hyper focus on metaphysics and the reaction against history that the modernist crisis created, right, safeguarded the objectivity of truth as opposed to the kind of subjectivism that you see in modernistic historicism, right, that wants to move along with this kind of Kantian denial of metaphysics, this kind of postmodern trajectory where reality becomes merely subjective, right? So the neo-Thomists were reacting against that, and so it tended, the criticism goes, to bracket the question of history, and anytime that question would pop up, it would smell like modernism, right? But Ratzinger says, well, if you read St. Bonaventure, according to those criteria, right, you would have to accuse St. Bonaventure of being a modernist, which is, not the case, obviously. And um, Ratzinger wants to say that we cannot separate history and ontology. In fact, history mediates ontology. It's through history that we come to encounter and discover and see the objective truth and reality of being itself, right? Through the many, we discover the one, right? And so, um, rereading the sentence here, although the nature of man cannot be defined while disregarding the freedom of the spirit, this implies also that it must not be defined, man's nature, metaphysical, while disregarding its history, the history of that nature. Okay. And so there is no ahistorical naturalness of man. I mean, that makes sense, right? I mean, you can abstract it, sure, but like it makes sense. There's no ahistorical um, nature, naturalness of man because man is a historical being. That's just a fact, right? Okay. We could demonstrate by means of a whole series of examples the fact that Bonaventure is conscious of the imprint of history upon nature. It will suffice to mention the two most important passages here. Whereas post Tridentine theology usually knows of only two domains of norms, which are both unhistorical, and those are the natural law as the domain of natura, alongside supernatura with its supernatural system of laws. Bonaventure, following tradition, so he's being a little snarky here, speaks of a triad that is thoroughly historical in character. So he's pitting Bonaventure against some post Tridentine expressions of this. And so for Bonaventure, you didn't have natura alongside supernatura in a thoroughly metaphysical and rather ahistorical schema. Rather, you had a historical schema that didn't deny metaphysics. Rather, it was a new kind of metaphysics compared to, say, what you might find in Aristotle. And so here is what Bonaventure's schema is. In Latin, it's tempus legis naturae, and then tempus legis scripte and tempus legis gratiae, right? Era of the natural law, era of the written law, and era of the law of grace. Now, if you're familiar with the patristics, you know that this is a schema that is thoroughly present in the patristic era, which is this tripartite historical schema of the the period of nature, the period of law, and the period of grace. Now, I have heard it being distinguished in terms of the period um, uh, of the So, even before Noah, and well, I think it's after Noah. I don't exactly remember, but the period of the patriarchs, right before the founding of Israel as a nation with the law from Sinai and Deuteronomy, etc. So you have the period of nature where you have its own priesthood, right? The firstborn son priesthood, what we call primogeniture. And then you have the period of the law, which comes from Moses, and that kind of stems all the way through the rest of the history of Israel in the Old Testament. And then, of course, the one we know is the period of grace, which starts with our Lord Jesus Christ and, is still with us today. And so Ratzinger writes, the mere conformity to natural law is a historical stage of mankind, its lowest, which does continue to be in effect as the basis for the rest, but is surmounted in principle by a stepwise ascent. After God spoke with the patriarchs, it was supposed by the entire by the entirely new level of direct dialogue with God, as this occurs preeminently in grace. Let me go ahead and explain that. What he's saying is that this natural law period isn't just something in the past. It's it is a historical time period in the past, but it's still with us as the basis upon which the other periods build. So upon this natural law is built the Mosaic law, and upon the Mosaic law is built the law of grace. Now, of course, because the law of grace is a fulfillment of the Mosaic law, it transforms the applicability without abolishing, as Jesus says, the Mosaic law, but it does transform it because it's a fulfillment. And so, in a certain sense, it's not that circumcision is gotten rid of, it's just that it moves from circumcision of the flesh to circumcision of the heart. And but also natural law is still present with us. Uh, it's just that it's distinct from divine law, right? Both old and new. So, and this is, very compatible with St. Thomas. I actually just wrote a paper on the thesis was how the law of the gospel is differs from the old law and the natural law. Um, it was yeah, it was really interesting. Continuing, so let me explain here. Let me reread it because I think it's helpful. The mere conformity to natural law is a historical stage of mankind. Its lowest. Got it. Which does continue to be in effect as the basis for the rest, right? Got it. But is surmounted in principle by a stepwise ascent. Got it. Makes sense. After God spoke with the patriarchs, it was surpassed, this natural law, right, by the entirely new level of direct dialogue with God, which is the Mosaic law, as this occurs, and then preeminently in grace, the law of Christ. Makes sense. Okay, moving forward. The other example is provided by the doctrine of original sin, when Bonaventure, again drawing upon tradition, especially on Augustine and Anselm, calls original sin a culpa non personalis sed naturalis, a guilt that is not personal but natural, and logically speaks then about man's natura corrupta, corrupt nature, which of course does not prevent him from distinguishing in his Christology between the nature of man that Christ was able to assume and the sin that he did not assume. That's very technical, but also very profound. Um, what he's saying is that, well, let me reread it and try to explain it as I reread it. The other example provided by the is provided by the doctrine of original sin. So when Bonaventure, again drawing upon these people, calls original sin a guilt that is not personal but natural. I want to stop there. It's original sin is not on the level. Remember the three levels, right? Nature, will, and supernature or supernatural, right? Original sin is not on the level of the will. What he means by this of the person, it doesn't mean it doesn't affect it, right? He's just saying that it's a sin of the first level of nature, right? And logically speaks then about man's corrupt nature, right? His nature is corrupt. Obviously, the will is affected by that, and it's fallen as well. But the point being is that the origin of this corruption is on the first level. And then, and this is how Bonaventure is able in his Christology to distinguish between sin and nature. Christ has our nature, but he doesn't have our sin. And so Christ has the first level, right? And but for him it's not corrupted by sin, right? And so that's why um I don't think I'm explaining this very well, actually. Excuse me. So, which of course does not prevent him from distinguishing in his Christology between the nature of man that Christ was able to assume. Okay, that's right. So, in other words, what he's saying is that even though sin has to do with the first category, that doesn't prevent him from distinguishing, even in that first category, between sin and the first category. In other words, nature is not totally depraved, right? Nature is something good. It's created by God, right? But sin happens in that first category. It affects the second, but the sin is natural and not personal. You see how that works? In other words, we all know that we inherit original sin, but we're not personally guilty of it. Rather, we're kind of born into it. In other words, it's not a personal guilt, it's a collective guilt in view of our nature as sons of Adam. So that's what Bonaventure is saying. It makes great sense, right? And so nature, will, where you might say person, right? And then grace. And so for Bonaventure, nature is where original sin applies and not will, even though it's affected by it, because we're not personally guilty for that sin. Rather, we inherit it in our nature. And that does not prevent him from distinguishing between that level, nature, and sin, even though that's where it's present. And he does this in his Christology, because Christ shares our nature, but not our sin. That's what he means. Moving on. Again, it becomes evident that the nature of man is marked by its history, even though simultaneously an inmost core, sorry, even though simultaneously an inmost core of an imperishable order of creation still gleams. That's his conclusion from both the Christology and the tripartite structure, which is that um, sin is tied to the historical period of nature, which is also a metaphysical category. But um, even there, it's not totally depraved. Something imperishable at the innermost core of that nature, right, gleams the goodness of creation, which makes it possible for this nature to become a space in which grace can work. Indeed, the locus of the incarnation of the Son of God. That's important because for Luther and Calvin, nature is not a space in which grace can work, because grace is radically extrinsic to nature, right? And because nature is totally depraved. For Bonaventure, precisely because nature is not totally depraved, it can be a place where grace works. It can have an intrinsic, aspect, and that's precisely where the incarnation takes place, in nature, right? So that's what he's saying. One more thing must be added if the picture is to be in some measure complete. Besides all the observations about nature from below, Bonaventure is acquainted also with the view from above. But if we observe nature from its true point of reference, from God's perspective, it becomes evident that in the end all nature is grace. Hoc totum quod fecit fuit gratia. All this that he made was grace. And that the natural course, is at bottom a voluntary course. So, in other words, what he's saying is that nature itself, right, presupposes almost like underneath it, right, the will of God. So, I want I want to make this clear. This is very dense theology, right? But if theologians are watching, give me some feedback. But nature, will, grace. But Bonaventure wants to say that, in a certain sense, will as a category, right, from God's perspective, not man's, is also undergirds nature. In other words, think of it this way: will is the origin, from it flows nature, and then man's will, and then grace is what brings man back to the original will of God, and that redeems the fallen nature. So nature's in between two wills here, the will of God and the will of man. And this is what he'll say. I mean, it's quite beautiful. Um, all of nature in its inmost depths is the outpouring of a will, is voluntaristically structured in terms of the primordial creative will, to which alone it owes its existence. And this is why he says the decisive thing remains the fact that nature in man is encompassed by a twofold freedom, by God's freedom and man's own freedom. This is what I was saying earlier. And it is marked by the dual single history that results from the partnership of man with God. This is very biblical, right? The covenantal. By the vocation from God that calls man to surpass himself, his nature, right? And thus to come into his true authenticity as as well as by the refusal of man who wants to be only a man. The will that falls back into a kind of bestial, corrupt nature. Let me reread that. By the vocation from God that calls man to surpass himself, and thus to come into his true authenticity, as well as by the refusal of man who wants to be only a man, who is afraid to set out beyond himself, and thus fails to achieve himself. Let us leave the question there. And okay, and then he says, let's turn to scripture. I hope you see that. It's quite beautiful. Let's see if I can recap. Again, repetitio est mater studiorum. Here's the recap. For Bonaventure, when talking about nature and grace, his schema is not that you sometimes find in post-Tridentine Catholic theology. Not everywhere, obviously. Because for Bonaventure, the post-Tridentine schema in some places would have been overly ahistorical. But for Bonaventure, history is very important. It's not only something that marks ontology, but something that mediates ontology. So for Bonaventure, it's not nature and grace in this ahistorical way, but rather history mediates nature, will, and supernatural. And we see this in these three historical periods: patriarchs, Moses and the rest of the Old Testament, Christ and the church, right? And so, but nature itself comes from God's will. That's creation. The spirit, the creator spiritus, right? The freedom of God. He releases creation, and its nature is the product of God's creative will. But man is called to surpass. Man as nature is called to surpass and exitus, right? Exodus, to surpass nature, because he also has a freedom, a will that goes beyond nature, that is called back through grace, through God's grace to the original will. And so what happens is that God creates nature. Man falls from that initial relationship of wills. This is why Christ becomes super important, his will and God's will. And man falls. And so what happens is that nature is corrupted. And the history of that corruption affects man's nature, right? And then through Christ, but it doesn't totally deprave it. And that nature Because not totally depraved, Christ enters into it, but without sin. There's a space there of the aboriginal goodness of creation that Christ inhabits, but he takes upon himself all that corrupt history, right? In the cross, and that union of Christ's will, when we enter into it by communion with Christ, are able to, heal nature and also elevate it back to God, theosis. So God's will, nature, our will, then grace that redeems the fallen nature back to God. That's the exitus reditus, the Neoplatonic framework. That's Bonaventure's schema. I like it. Okay. Now, what is nature? Isn't that the question? What is nature? Well, let's go to scripture, basically. Okay. So Ratzinger will give a lot of citations that I won't read. You'll just have to trust me on the citations. It's on pages 155 through 157. But he makes 3 points about the word physis, right? Or I've heard it physis as well, but um, he makes 3 points, and I'm going to read those 3 points. The first point, so this is about this word nature in scripture. First, we find a biological, or with regard to man, a racial concept of nature corresponding to the Jewish roots of Paul's thought. So the first level is biological or of birth, right, which is a particular race. Here, the image that Paul will use the branch, right, and coming from a particular branch. So birth and biology and descent, right, as the and race, therefore, is the first meaning of this word. So he says, first, we find a biological or a racial concept of nature corresponding to the Jewish roots of Paul's thought. This is how the Jews thought of this. Indeed, for the Jews, race, namely the lineage of those who were descended from Abraham, was at the same time a theological category. Salvation is fundamentally bound up with the children of Abraham. For all others, race, then, likewise becomes theologically significant, and by all others, he means non Jews, right? But in a negative way, since they are not descended from Abraham, they do not belong to the covenant people and do not come under God's promises, the covenant, which involves the will, as we'll see. Okay, that's the first meaning of nature. So that's what that means. Nature means your biology, right? And that kind of brings us to this. Well, it's more the third point, but the second point. Sorry for being all over the place. After citing a bunch of quotations, he moves on to the second point. There is also, Ratzinger says, however, a passage in which Paul uses a concept of nature that he is obviously borrowing from the popular Stoic philosophy. Nature, not in the sense of bloodline or a biological category, but rather in the sense of an essential structure that is rationally understood. So here's a metaphysical category. Now, the Stoic picture is not drawn exactly and thoroughly, rather, by Paul, right? Rather, it is presented only in a very attenuated popular science sense. Nonetheless, it is there. The Greek roots in the thinking of St. Paul make their presence known. This is so nature is a metaphysical category, a kind of structure of being, right? It's ontological, and but it has its own law. And I'm not going to read this section, but he goes on to talk about it, where this category has its own law, and he calls it natural law. And this comports entirely with St. Thomas's definition of natural law. For St. Thomas, natural law is not it's not a form in human nature. It's not a habit of human nature intrinsic to its being. Rather, it's a structure. Rather, human nature can deduce through abstraction. The human being can deduce through abstraction the moral precept of doing good and avoiding evil, right? And he can do so. He can consider that truth, right, through his intellect in a habitual manner. And so that's what natural law is. For Thomas, natural law is a um, dictate of reason that can be discovered by looking at the natural world. It has a kind of intelligibility that I can deduce moral principles from. That's natural law. So in other words, it's not a kind of people think natural law is like the laws of gravity, or even maybe like the kind of law of I don't know, some kind of the way your organs work or something, right? No, it's actually a rational principle that man can come to the conclusion of. And he says it's self-evident, just as the principles of speculative reason are self-evident, like principle of non-contradiction. The principles of practical reason are also self-evident, like do good and avoid evil, and that pertains to self-preservation, propagation of the species, and what's rationally good. Basically not offending people you live with, and not being ignorant. So those are the three levels. That was a tangent. Let's move on to the third section here. So to recap real quick, Ratzinger talks about the first category, the first way in which in the New Testament, especially by Paul, the word nature is used is to mean biology or race, particularly how it relates to descent. And that's imbued with a theological meaning precisely because it's descent from Abraham and applies to those who are part of the covenant, right? The second way in which Paul uses it is a kind of it's borrowing from Stoic philosophy, and it means a metaphysical ontological category, a structure of human nature. Um, yeah, ontologically considered. Thirdly, he says, with the coming of Christianity arose a new situation in which, on the one hand, the biological concept of nature becomes a theological concept in a new sense. Nature is understood not in terms of biology or rational metaphysics, so one and two, right? But rather in terms of the concrete history that has taken and is taking place between God and man overall. We find Christianity distinguishing itself, the development of a typically Christian way of thinking that as yet has no categories of its own, but is already beginning to develop them as it addresses issues, even in a concept that is at first peripheral. So, in other words, he's saying something new is happening with Christianity. And he's going to explain what that is. But I can already tell you what's new is if anyone's read I've been reading it recently at our Bible study, the letter to the Romans. Paul, the structure of the letter to the Romans, such a incredible letter. The structure begins with Gentiles, how they're guilty because of sin, then Jews, how they're also guilty because of sin, and then he says all are guilty because of sin, Gentile and Jew, right? And he says that the covenant, the race, the lineage, the biology, the nature, right? Even though it comes from Abraham, is also guilty. That is actually new, right? For the Jew, it's like the Gentiles are guilty because of their race. Guilty in the sense where it's more like they're not in the dialogue with God, but the race of the Jews is in dialogue with God, and therein lies the right path. Unlike the Gentiles who are children of wrath, the Jew is the child of God, right? Paul says, you know what? No, Gentile and Jew are children of wrath. Uh, because to be a true Jew, and he says this in Romans, is not something outwardly, something a circumcision of the flesh or even descent, right? But it's something inwardly, and he calls it faith. And he ties it to the spirit, right? Spiritual man versus the fleshly man. So it takes the Christian view here. This is so cool to me. The Pauline view here is universal, right? It steps outside of the dichotomy between Jew and Gentile and establishes a new metaphysics. That's awesome. I love that. Paul is doing something very new here. He's breaking. It's a fulfillment, obviously, right? But he's doing something that's neither Jewish nor Stoic or Gentile, whatever that means. But he's doing something new. So let's go ahead and read Ratzinger and see how he explains it. He says in Ephesians, Paul speaks, and he gives the verse and everything in the chapter. It's Ephesians 2:3. Paul speaks with his compatriots, the Jews, and points out to them that they too, or from his perspective, we have sinned. We were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. For the Jews, this was an unheard of and positively nonsensical statement, linguistically nonsensical as well. By nature, on account of their birth, the others, the non Jews, are children of wrath, right? The Jews, however, are not, precisely because of their nature, because of their descent, right? We see that we see here that physis per se belongs to the biological usage and again means something like quote on account of our birth according to our natural origins end quote, but it acquires a completely new meaning inasmuch as Paul now declares to the race of the redeemed, not only the others are by nature children of wrath, but we are too. You see, that's kind of what I was saying. All are, and that's throughout Romans, right? First 3 4 chapters. The universality of this statement objectively abolishes the racism that is still present linguistically and replaces it with a completely new universality. Paul, the Christian, no longer takes a natural racial event as his point of departure. Instead, salvation comes from the spiritual event of believing. Merely natural existence, in and of itself, is in any case without salvation. That's a pretty radical extrinsicism there, right? As the quote people of God end quote concept is divested of its racial and biological connotation, so necessarily is the concept of nature along with it. By birth, according to one's natural origins alone, no one is saved. In German, I'm Heil. But rather, everyone is in ruins. In German, I'm Unheil. It's a pun, basically. This means that concrete nature, as it is in fact bestowed on man in his birth, is not a salvific order. It can't save itself. That's why Augustine is correct. Pelagius here was very anti-Pauline, right? Um, so not only is it not God, as the Stoics taught, but it is also not a direct expression of the divine intentions. He's talking about nature. Let me reread that. Nature here, right? Nature. Not only is it not God, as the Stoics taught, for the Stoics, it was a kind of pantheism, but it is also not a direct expression of the divine intentions. Nature, as fallen, is not God's will, right? Because it does not fall to man's lot, so to speak, directly from God, right? Because all the messiness is not from God. It's what we did with it. It's the fall, right? Rather, it is warped and disfigured by a long human prehistory that burdens it, this nature. It is marked not only by him who once created it, God, but it is likewise and even more clearly but it likewise and even more clearly bears the traces of man who has abused it. You see what I'm saying? So again, going back to the very beginning of what Saint Bonaventure said, in nature you have both this good that remains, which is a kind of a glimpse of the original goodness of creation because it comes from God, God's will, right? And yet, because of the fall, we have disfigured it, and that history of disfigurement comes along with the package. So you have a distinction, however, which is why in Christology, Bonaventure can say that nature still remains a place where grace can work because it's not totally depraved. That's why Jesus Christ did take on our nature, but without sin. And that is the space in which we can enter, right? Where grace is present to bring our nature back through the will to the divine will in a communion of wills, right? Which is the person of Jesus Christ, right? In Jesus Christ, the human and divine will are in a communion of love. They're aligned, right? In the passage in Gethsemane, more could be said about that. St. Thomas has a really interesting way of explaining that. But that's that. Okay, moving on. He continues. If we try to summarize the Pauline data, we find that Paul no doubt attributes to nature a certain guiding character. By the way, let me just check what time it is. I have to run later. Okay. So if we try to summarize the Pauline data, we find that Paul no doubt attributes to nature a certain guiding character, but it by no means assumes the status of an unambiguous and absolute norm. What he's saying here is that Paul actually says, think Romans 1, right? Like not just one, actually one, two, and three. He says that some Gentiles obey the law by obeying nature, right? So for that, that's a positive thing. Natural law, basically, what St. Thomas would call natural law, right? That's a positive thing. But it's not just positive, because nature for Paul is also ambiguous, and it's not an absolute norm, and that's because it's been marred, right? And so he explains this. Man, Ratzinger says, receives true enlightenment about his being, not from nature, but rather from his encounter with Christ in faith. That's the point of Romans. Even though they follow the nature, which is good, right? It's still not enough, right? It's not enough. Christ, right, is grace is what's needed. He continues, nature can very well be the sign of the creator. Sure, yeah, and of course, right? But it is not so with perfect clarity, because it is also the expression of man's high-handedness, all that messiness, right? Once again, we find, as in Bonaventure's writings, the nature of man in tension between two freedoms, God's and man's. But Paul's letters reveal even more momentously the resulting conflict. His interpretation of Paul here is just amazing. Sorry, all right. But Paul's letters reveal even more momentously the resulting conflict, the peculiar tension of the human being, which announces itself in a nature that is just as much the expression of God's call as it is that of his wrath. And this is where it's beautiful. He goes, this section here is called Attempt at a Synthesis. Now, the word synthesis is crucial. He says, and I skipped some of the stuff here, but he says, this genuine humanity of man, the created order, man, is completely extinguished in no man. It lies at the basis of every single human person, and in many different ways continuously has its effects on man's concrete existence, summoning and guiding him. All this is good, right? This is so good. But of course, in no man is it present without warping or falsification. Instead, in every individual, it is caked with the layer of filth that Pascal once aptly called the second nature of man. Man has obtained for himself a second nature, the core of which is the susceptibility to egoism, concupiscence. This is also why, in both ancient and modern languages, the word man it has a peculiarly ambiguous set of connotations, in which high and low, noble and base things are strangely intertwined. The conclusion of this is so good, but I hope you see that, right? So, the comment that someone made on my previous video on, Dom, what is nature? You need to define that. Yeah, and that's kind of what this video is really taking a closer look at nature, human nature, right? And Ratzinger's humanism will come out here. It's in a quite beautiful way. So let's just, to recap, right? So God's will creates, right? Creation unfolds in history. At one point, Ratzinger says that the cosmos is history, right? But God creates, creation. Creation unfolds in history. The first historical level, which is not devoid of ontology, it's a thing, it's a reality, it's objectively, it has ontological weight, right? Nature, nature. But then, the step above that, right, is will, right? Freedom. And then a step above that is grace. But the thing is, man's will, right, fell, thereby distorting the first step, and thereby through the law, which could not heal man's will. This is the Old Testament. This is the Christian theology. This is Catholic theology, right? So man's will cannot be healed by the law, but only by grace. And we talked about that last video. But what happens here is when Jesus Christ enters nature, because it's still good, even though it's all corrupt, he takes all that history and lets it, he takes it all in, right? And flips it upside down, right? Through his union of his will with God, the original will, right? And then we enter in communion with Christ, thereby being healed, and all of that history is being atoned for. It's being transformed into the expression of filial love suffering, right? This I'm thinking of Dr. Margaret Turek's book, Atonement. And and that transforms the whole cosmos, brings it back to God through Christ. It's a Christification of the cosmos, right? And through grace the will can be united to God, and nature, which is so this is the drama of salvation. I mean, this is Balthazar as well, right? Which is, you have God's will, God's freedom, and man's freedom, man's will, and it's a drama. And in the middle you have sin and grace, fighting it out, and Christ is the kind of epicenter of this whole drama. I don't know. This gets me excited, man. This is so good. All right, let's continue. Um, okay, so I'm going to skip some. He gives some quotes here. Well, I think this one's really good. I don't remember who it's from, but he quotes it. Oh, Cardinal Saliege. Don't know who that is, but I guess I'll find out soon. Okay, he says here, here's the quote. With the phrase, that's only human, people excuse everything nowadays. People get divorced, that's only human. People drink, that's only human. Someone cheats on an examination or in a competition, that's only human. Someone squanders his youth on vice, that's only human. People work sluggishly, that's only human. People embezzle, that's only human. There is no vice that people do not excuse with this formula. In this way, people designate with the word human the weakest and basest features of a man. Often it is even used as a synonym for beastly. What a peculiar language! After all, humanity is precisely what distinguishes us from the animals. What is only human? The intellect, the heart, the will, the conscience, holiness. Those things are human. Excuse me. So I hope you see this ambivalence, right? This high and low, this noble and base dimension of humanity. And I love this section here. This is where he says the following. And is not this ambivalence of the word man epitomized in a truly moving way in the man, who is the standard, goal, and perfection of all humanity, who called himself the Son of Man, and in this expression united exaltation and lowliness in a span that reaches from the glory of God down to the abyss of utter rejection. How beautiful. I mean, the whole gospel is there. Think of the Magnificat, Our Lady, and how she enters into the mystery of Christ at the Annunciation, throughout her life, and the way she accompanies our Lord, how she's mentioned by John and Luke, right? And also at the cross, especially, and even after the ascension at Pentecost, and in Mary, who is the personification of the church. You have the whole gospel unfolding in Mary. It's oh man, it's so great. And this is true humanism, but we'll get to that. So Ratzinger says it is clear the way that grace travels to reach man has to pass through the second nature that Pascal mentioned, right? Breaking open the hard shell of vainglory that covers the divine glory within man, within him, right? Um, and is this not a glimpse into the Paschal mystery, really? And here he says, only the humanity of the second Adam is the true humanity. Only the humanity that endured the cross brings the true man to light. The humanism based merely on what is noble about man eventually leads to man's self assertion and self isolation and the refusal of God's new reality. I'm thinking of some of the atheistic humanisms that we've seen last century. And then he says, of course, guess what he quotes, right? Let us listen to once more to de Lubac. And de Lubac says, yeah. Anyway, de Lubac says, Christian humanism must be a converted humanism. There is no smooth transition from a natural to a supernatural love. To find himself, man must lose himself. In a spiritual dialectic as imperative in all its severity for humanity as for the individual, that is, imperative for my love of man and of mankind, as well as for my love of myself. Exodus and ecstasy are governed by the same law. Oh, it's so awesome. So great. There really is a spiritual flavor to the Lubac that is really incredible. I mean, these men, right? They were true humanists. Um, anyway, doesn't mean he got it right about nature and grace. I don't know. I'm gonna look more into it, but um, it's undeniable that there's a spiritual, I don't know, aura, right, to the Lubeck. Um, and so Ratzinger here in the passage kind of says, again, in light of this, the cross, the baseness that in which only we can find the true glory of man. In other words, in God, not selfishness, right? We have to be careful, however, because he says, if we focus only on man's nobility, then we can reject God and become atheists, really. but if we, therefore, we must focus on the conversion, the exodus of the cross, enter into the baseness, into the humility. That's what humility means, right? In order to discover true glory. But he says, but don't forget, human nature is not totally depraved, and that actually grounds the principle of common sense, which is actually antagonistic to a kind of fanatic, a kind of pessimistic Catholicism, right? A kind of very, wagging the finger Catholicism. That I'll just read it here. He says, "Meanwhile, of course, one must not lose sight of the other side of the whole thing. Although the created order of true humanity is no longer the concrete order of man, it is not a mere abstraction either, not just a name. Despite everything, it intrudes again and again into reality as well. So the good part, right, of humanity that sin didn't destroy. This has to be a permanent warning against an eccentric spirituality. In contrast to that, there is in fact something like common sense, a sound human understanding, in which the consciousness of the abiding order of creation makes itself known. Man should allow himself to be corrected again and again by this awareness, and to be called back to the ground of reality. This knowledge about the abiding power of the created order ought to give to the Christian's ethos of the cross a salutary sobriety that safeguards him against all fanaticism, eccentricity, or extravagance, right? Kind of, yeah. Indeed, a holy optimism will illuminate Christian life from that source and guard the Paschal way. That's just a beautiful dialectic there, which often enough is hard against all false melancholy, and impress on it the victorious gladness that befits the Christian as someone who hopes. And that's really his point. And he says this in Principles of Catholic Theology about joy. The gospel is really marked by joy. It's a healing of human nature and thus an affirmation of man, but it does go through the cross. So there is, again, two things to hold together in tension. And so I will conclude with the final passage here, because it's been almost an hour. That's not bad. But, this has basically been Ratzinger's take on this. And it's not like you have to choose one vision over another. That's something that I've really noticed is that um, because the mysteries of the faith surpass our theology, it there's two things we want to say. We first want to say that it's therefore not, if the mysteries of the faith surpass our theology, that doesn't mean that our theology is meaningless. That would be something. So Ratzinger talks about this in his book Truth and Tolerance, on the question of religions. And he says that that would be a kind of radical relativism that is more akin to kind of Asian mysticism, right? Where everything is, things can be contradictory because at the end of the day, it's just a kind of symbolic expression of something that is unnameable and unattainable and unrepresentable. And so all theology kind of loses its seriousness. And so a kind of pantheism ensues that is more enlightened than what the people need. It's um, that's not Christianity. Our theology matters, right? So that's one extreme. The other extreme is to think that a theological vision exhausts the mysteries, and that therefore there's no compatibility with any other theological vision within this kind of plurality of theological schools in Catholicism. That's also the other extreme that we want to avoid, because although we can say true things, the truth transcends what we can say. And so Ratzinger actually he says at one point that he wrestled with this question and came to the conclusion that we cannot let go. He wrestled with it intellectually. It's not like he ever stopped believing in truth, but he wrestled with how to articulate the fact that we can't let go of truth, because if we do, the consequences are devastating. And that's what his book, Truth and Tolerance, talks about. I mean, his book on politics and, um, democracy and church and state relations and all that stuff. Awesome stuff. All right, well, let's conclude with this section here. He says, but if it is the case, then he goes, sorry, I'm kind of reading this out of juncture, but the exi, so exi, Latin go forth, right? That begins the revelation to Abraham, is this perpetual fundamental law of Exodus, which is perfected in the Christian mystery of the Pasch and is confirmed as the definitive fundamental law of revelation, and at the same time also as the fundamental law of the Spirit, the genuine fulfillment of the yearning cry that arises out of its nature. This is his take on the nature grace. This is the culmination of these two videos. What he believes, what he extrapolates. If that is all true, right? The Spirit, fulfillment of the yearning cry that arises out of its nature, then the cross is not the crucifixion of man at all, as Nietzsche thought, but rather his true healing, which saves him from the deceptive self sufficiency in which he can only lose himself and miss out on the endless promise that lies within him for the sake of the bourgeois mush of his supposed naturalness, he's criticizing today. Then the paschal way of the cross, this breaking down of all earthly assurances and their false satisfactions, is man's true homecoming, the true cosmic harmony in which God will be everything to everyone. 1 Corinthians 15:28, in which the whole world is a song of praise to God and to the paschal lamb who was slain, from Revelation 5. This really makes me think of his work on eschatology. In fact, Ratzinger says, the cross is not the destruction of man, but rather the foundation of true humanity, about which the New Testament says the unfathomably beautiful words, quote, the goodness and loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, end quote, from Titus 3:4. The humanity of God. This is indeed the true humanity of man, the grace that fulfills nature, end quote. So, that's his take. I will let you know about my future my future reading. So I just wanted to say a few things. So I'm reading this right here, right? Of course, C'est Naturel by de Lubac, and I thought it wasn't translated in English, and in a certain sense it isn't, in a certain sense it is, because I discovered that two parts of this book are in fact in English, right here. So I have them both so I'm going to read it in French first, then I'm going to reread the English translations, because I know people are um, debating in America over these two over here. But in here, there are passages that are not in those two. That's why I want to make sure I read this all the way through. And reading it twice can really help me get a grasp of what he's saying. And then I'm going to read Dr. Feingold's, I think, what's it called? Treatment of this. He's doesn't think de Lubac is correct. And there's also this one that I've purchased. This is why I'm poor. This is why you should help me. But this is by Jacob Wood, To Stir a Restless Heart, Thomas Aquinas and Henri de Lubac, on nature, grace, and the desire for God. So I've heard he is fair to the Thomistic tradition and to de Lubac. And if my understanding is correct, he sides with neither. So I'm interested in that. I know there's Dr. Swafford's book as well, where he kind of brings in Matthias Schieben into the conversation. I just wanted to bring Ratzinger into this conversation, right? But it is true that Balthasar as well would not. Balthasar would be much more on the Saint Maximus side of things, which would be closer to Bonaventure, although different. But they would be, like nodding, right? They'd be agreeing with each other. So yeah, so that's been my foray into this topic, and man, it's just so beautiful. Like, I've been listening to a lot of Mozart, especially his piano concerto 14 and 23 right now. I've been stuck on those two. Man, it's like swimming in a sea of beauty. I can't get enough of this stuff. And theology is so awesome. And like a lot of what's going on online, these fighting about papacy and the council and stuff. And it's like, when I step away from that and dive into theology, it's like it all becomes like it's like I'm realizing it's ridiculous. It's stupid. Everyone's fighting over this stuff, but it's like yeah, it's like this reduction of all things to politics. Michael Hamby talked about that in one of his articles. I thought it was great. But it's like, and that's something. So I want to point you guys to two videos I will be making, and then I have to run. I'll be making a video on the relationship between the papacy and the church, based on some stuff that I've been reading in Ratzinger and others. And um, a lot of people think Vatican One, because Vatican One is kind of like, it stems out of a controversy over conciliarism and ultramontanism. And Catholics after Vatican One thought that ultramontanism won. Ratzinger makes some really good points, and it's really beautiful and awesome. And that basically, like, no, like Vatican One condemns both conciliarism and ultramontanism, and opts for a third way that's much more satisfying and in conformity with the nature of the church and the way things work. Of course, without denying, the truths about, um, what we all hold to and know to be dogmatic. So I'll be making a video on that. And I might make this next one here first because I don't know what's going on. I had a friend of mine. I know Drew the Catholic wrote it. I'm friends with Drew the Catholic. He wrote a post on his locals that I read. And apparently there's some stuff going on online of people using the slogan Christ is King in a kind of like anti-Semitic and like uh, integralist in the wrong sense, because that word can be used correctly, right? But in a way that has been really like disconcerting. And I think because I remember watching a video by Bishop Barron, he's being interviewed by Ben Shapiro, and Shapiro mentioned something, so I don't know what's going on. There's probably some stuff going on out there, probably Twitter. And so I'm going to make a video on Ratzinger's understanding of the relationship between church and state. I was talking to some friends about that. I think a couple days ago. Um, yeah, Chris Plants, Timothy Flanders, Richard DeClue, and we were talking. And Jacob as well. We were talking about what Ratzinger writes in Jesus of Nazareth, and it was kind of disconcerting. But anyway, that's a video I'm going to make. But it's going to be about the relationship between church and state, politics, eschatology, stuff like that. Oh, and I had promised a friend that I was going to make a video on the resurrection in Ratzinger, because there's at the end of Intro to Christianity, if at face value, some people thought that Ratzinger was denying the resurrection, which is, of course, not the case. But it's actually much more intricate what's going on there, and he explains himself in eschatology and other places. So I'm running out of steam. This is a good place to end. I just want to let you guys know I'm going to make a video on the relationship between the church and the state in light of this Christ is King thing going on that I don't really know about. And I have seen some people say things where I'm like, you gotta be careful with that. You gotta be careful with that. And then the other video, what did I say I was doing? Can't remember. Shoot, what was I saying? The resurrection, church and state. Dang, my memory's bad. All right, I have to run, but we have two people here. Great presentation. Thanks, Haley. Appreciate it. What's up, Jay Pronobis? Okay, so if you enjoy this content, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and consider supporting me at patreon.com/thelogosproject. And I am now offering classes online for sale where we talk over Zoom. I have some courses that I've worked on ecclesiology. I teach Latin if you want to learn Latin. And I also have been teaching a kind of world religions class and what makes Christianity distinctive. And it's based off of Ratzinger's book, Truth and Tolerance. And so Mariology is also a class that I give that I really like, because I feel like Marian apologetics are rather awful. And I think a more serious approach is needed, and I have found it in some of these theologians. So for that, go to www.theecclesiablog.com. You have there all my podcasts, you have my articles, and you have those classes for sale. And I will be eventually trying to link the new t-shirts for the Logos project that I have up. Everything will be on that website. So check that out. If you like this stuff, support me. And without further ado, we'll see you all next time. Thanks for tuning in. God bless.